Dear friends of the National Italian-American Foundation, I am honored to join you at the 47th Gala Awards. At moments like this, when we celebrate heritage, leadership, and transatlantic friendship, it is worth reflecting on how quickly politics can shift, not only in one country, but across an entire continent. What if the most consequential political battle in modern Europe has already begun, and much of the world barely noticed? For months, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, appeared firmly in control in Brussels. She had weathered crises before: Brexit, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, inflation shocks, and energy shortages. Her leadership of the European Green Deal was presented as the defining mission of a generation. Her fiscal framework was described as the responsible path forward for stability, and her commission projected confidence that the European Union's long-term integration was irreversible. But on a cold morning in January 2026, Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, stepped before the cameras in Rome and said something that cut straight to the heart of Brussels' authority. She declared that the European Commission no longer had the moral or political right to dictate how sovereign nations manage their money and energy policies. This was not a routine disagreement behind closed doors. It was not a minor dispute over regulatory language. It was a direct challenge to the centralizing logic that has driven the European Union for decades. And from that moment, the political temperature across Europe began to rise. A sentence that echoed across Europe. Within hours, Meloni's words reverberated across European capitals. In Warsaw, allies of Viktor Orban praised what they described as long-overdue candor about Brussels' overreach. In Paris, figures from Marine Le Pen's political camp framed it as evidence that national sovereignty was staging a comeback. In The Hague, supporters of Geert Wilders cited Rome's defiance as proof that resistance to centralized EU control was no longer fringe politics. Inside the Berlaymont building in Brussels, however, the mood was markedly different. Officials understood that this was not merely rhetorical theater. Meloni had identified a structural vulnerability in the European project, the growing gap between centralized decision-making and national political realities. At the core of the dispute lay fiscal rules. The fiscal squeeze. Italy's public debt has long been among the highest in Europe relative to GDP. Under the EU's revised fiscal framework, Rome faces pressure to reduce deficits and implement structural reforms. Brussels argues that fiscal discipline is necessary to protect the euro and ensure long-term stability. But the economic environment of 2026 is not the low-interest, high-growth era in which many of those rules were originally designed. Inflation remains elevated in parts of the eurozone. Borrowing costs have increased sharply since the pandemic-era stimulus programs. Growth is sluggish in major economies, including Germany. France faces persistent budgetary and political challenges. Meloni has argued that imposing strict spending cuts during economic stagnation risks deepening social strain and slowing recovery. She characterizes the Commission's approach as economically pro-cyclical, tightening policy precisely when flexibility is needed most. The Commission, for its part, maintains that credibility in financial markets depends on fiscal discipline. Yet the tension is undeniable: how to balance sustainability with growth in a fragmented political landscape. The Green Deal under pressure. The conflict extends far beyond fiscal policy. At stake is also the future of the European Green Deal, championed by von der Leyen as a transformative blueprint to make Europe climate neutral by 2050. One of its most debated elements is the planned 2035 phase-out of new internal combustion engine vehicle sales. Supporters argue it provides clarity and drives innovation. Critics contend that the timeline is overly rigid and economically disruptive, particularly for regions heavily dependent on traditional automotive manufacturing. Meloni has positioned herself as a leading voice for revisiting certain climate timelines. Working with governments in Central Europe, Italy supported amendments allowing greater flexibility in fuel technologies. While Brussels framed these adjustments as pragmatic refinements, critics saw them as a significant concession. The broader question is whether Europe can simultaneously lead on climate ambition and maintain industrial competitiveness. European car makers face growing competition from Chinese electric vehicle producers. Infrastructure rollouts, especially charging networks, have been uneven across member states. Households in lower-income regions often struggle with higher upfront costs associated with electric vehicles. Meloni's argument is that environmental goals must align with economic realities and technological readiness. Von der Leyen's camp insists that delay risks falling behind in the global clean tech race. Energy, geopolitics, and Africa. Energy security adds another layer to the power struggle. Italy has sought to transform itself into a Mediterranean energy hub, expanding cooperation with North African partners such as Algeria and Libya. Through pipeline agreements and renewable energy partnerships, Rome aims to diversify supply routes and strengthen its strategic role. Meloni's strategy blends traditional energy sources with long-term renewable investments. She argues that transitional fuels remain necessary to protect industry and households while green capacity scales up. The Commission supports diversification as well, but prefers coordinated EU-level frameworks with regulatory safeguards. Italy's more bilateral approach underscores a philosophical difference. Should energy strategy be centralized or driven primarily by national initiatives within a common market?
Migration and national control. Migration has long tested European unity. The EU's efforts to establish a common asylum and relocation framework have repeatedly encountered resistance from member states with differing political pressures. Italy, as a frontline Mediterranean country, has advocated external partnerships to reduce irregular arrivals. Agreements with North African authorities aim to disrupt smuggling networks and manage flows before they reach European shores. Supporters of this approach cite declines in certain arrival statistics as evidence of effectiveness. Critics raise concerns about human rights safeguards and long-term sustainability. Here again, the debate reflects deeper questions about sovereignty, solidarity, and institutional legitimacy. Relations with the United States. Transatlantic dynamics further complicate matters. While the European Commission conducts trade negotiations on behalf of the EU, national leaders also cultivate bilateral relationships. Meloni has emphasized Italy's alignment with Washington on defense spending and strategic technology policy. She has pledged increases in defense investment consistent with NATO benchmarks and has signaled caution regarding sensitive technological partnerships involving China. Von der Leyen likewise prioritizes strong EU-US ties, but seeks to ensure coordination at the European level. Divergence in style and emphasis feeds perceptions, fair or not, that influence in shaping Europe's global posture is contested. The democratic question. Perhaps the most sensitive aspect of the confrontation concerns democratic legitimacy. The President of the European Commission is nominated by member state leaders and approved by the European Parliament. Supporters argue this provides democratic accountability within a supranational framework. Critics counter that the process feels distant to many citizens and insufficiently transparent. Meloni has tapped into a broader European debate: how much authority should be exercised at the EU level versus national parliaments. As regulatory scope expands into digital policy, artificial intelligence, environmental standards, and fiscal oversight, concerns about bureaucratic overreach resonate with segments of the electorate. Von der Leyen's defenders respond that collective action is precisely what gives Europe leverage in a world of superpowers. Fragmentation, they argue, would weaken the continent economically and geopolitically. A defining moment. The struggle unfolding between Rome and Brussels is not a simple binary clash of personalities. It reflects structural tensions embedded in the European project since its inception: integration versus sovereignty, uniformity versus flexibility, ambition versus feasibility. If the Commission doubles down on existing frameworks, it risks fueling further resistance. If it compromises too visibly, it may embolden calls for broader decentralization. The coming year will test whether the European Union can adapt to shifting political winds while preserving cohesion. Will integration continue to deepen, or will a looser model of cooperation among assertive nation-states emerge? For 450 million Europeans, these questions are not abstract. They affect energy bills, industrial jobs, border policy, environmental standards, and global influence.
History may look back on January 2026 as a turning point, not necessarily because one leader won, but because the balance of power and expectations shifted. The European Union has survived crises before. Its resilience has often depended on its capacity to reform. Whether this moment becomes a fracture or a renewal will depend on compromise, leadership, and the willingness of institutions and governments alike to respond to citizens' concerns without abandoning long-term stability. Europe stands at a crossroads. The debate now underway will shape not only its internal governance, but its role in a rapidly changing world.